Hey, David.
Hey, David.
It's good to see you. I've been a big fan of your work for a long time. David and I have known each other for many years. The book is about, at a 50,000 foot view, the relationship between a handful of huge law firms and political leaders. There are these special giant law firms that are colloquially referred to as big law. Just give us an overview of what big law is and why it kind of flies under the radar. I feel like there's like political people know about big law, but I feel like the general public doesn't really know about what is referred to as big law. What is it?
So, big law is a constellation of the world's largest, most powerful law firms. And these are law firms that many of them have thousands of lawyers. Some are smaller than that. All of them rake in billions of dollars a year in revenue advising. And you referred to politicians, but really their bread and butter is advising the world's biggest, baddest companies on ways to basically operate with impunity. So you're right that they have skated largely under the public radar for most of their existence. And I think that's partly a function of the fact that until fairly recently, this was not known as an industry. It was known as a profession. Lawyers liked to claim that they were not motivated by the profit motive. They were not interested in winning at all costs. They were simply officers of the court operating in a public spirited way, trying to achieve fairness, truth, and justice. That sounds anachronistic, and it is very much an anachronism at this point. But the other big reason that this has been under the radar to such a large degree is that the media, the mainstream media in particular, and I count myself as part of this, honestly, has just really kind of fallen down on the job over the years because these lawyers of these big firms become our best sources. And it's not like we're saying, "Oh, you're our best source. I'm not going to write this critical story." It's a little more subconscious, and it gets ingrained in us that we view these people as operating kind of in a peripheral way and a little bit behind the scenes, and therefore not really the main story. And I think that's just been a colossal mistake.
You focus on one of these giant law firms, a firm called Jones Day. Why is that law firm so important? Why'd you choose that law firm? Why does everybody need to know about that specific firm?
Well, there's two answers. The short answer is Trump. And this is the law firm that, starting in early 2015, began representing the Trump campaign. And it used that relationship to basically develop a very powerful foothold, not just in Trump world, although it did that, but also in this whole kind of community of Trumpists. And so today, the law firm, and first of all, it largely staffed the Trump administration. The White House was filled with Jones Day lawyers. The Justice Department was, other federal agencies as well. Jones Day, once and future Jones Day lawyers who were in the White House helped remake the federal judiciary, and they were responsible for the 3 Supreme Court justices that Trump got on the court. And so they just wield enormous influence in, not just with Trump, but with all of these candidates who have are following in Trump's footsteps, ranging from Dr. Oz to, they have a relationship with the Herschel Walker campaign down in Georgia, on and on, the list goes. And that's the thing that is kind of sexiest and I think most pressing right now. To me, what's actually a little more interesting, and I think actually more deserving of public awareness and thought, is the fact that Jones Day, as much as any other big corporate law firm, it represents not only a who's who of corporate bad boys, but it has gone to extraordinary and at times unethical and even illegal lengths to help those clients win, not only in court, but defeating or kind of watering down government regulations, helping clients avoid taxes, helping clients hide money, things like that. And Jones Day is not unusual in that regard. In fact, the reason I picked them is because in a lot of ways, they are an embodiment of what the legal profession has become as it morphs into the legal industry. And so I just think I think the power of these huge law firms is in many ways, and has really distorted our system of American justice, which a hallmark of that is that there's an adversarial system where two lawyers from opposing sides zealously represent their individual clients in court, and it's left to impartial juries and judges to kind of sort out fact from fiction. But that system is predicated on the idea that there is something resembling an equilibrium between the two parties. And that equilibrium is long gone. And, it's a very lopsided system of justice where the people and institutions that can afford these huge law firms just have an immense advantage over just about everyone else.
Jones Day, to stay on the Trump issue for a sec, Jones Day, it seems to me they were doing two macro sets of things at once. They were effectively infiltrating the government in ways that helped their corporate clients regulatorily, policy-wise. And then they were also involved in helping Trump try to maintain power, to potentially steal the election, overthrow the results of the election in 2020. Talk to us about that latter part, what they did in the election, and whether it caused any consternation that we know of inside the firm. I mean, these are giant firms with lots of people, so they don't necessarily act as monoliths. Were there people who inside the firms who saw what they did in the election, that Jones Day did in the election, and were not happy with that?
Yeah, even before the election, I mean, through most of 2020, there were senior people, both Republicans and Democrats alike, who were aware of the increasingly incendiary and kind of unhinged rhetoric that Trump and his allies were using, warning about the risks of a rigged election, things like that. And people warned inside the law firm up to the very highest levels that this was, not only should we not be condoning this type of rhetoric, but our association with the Trump campaign, given this just completely anti-democratic, dishonest, the nonsense that they were spreading, was potentially very destructive to the firm's values and the firm's reputation. And those complaints, I think a lot of people internally agreed with them, but nothing was done about them. And so the firm continued representing Trump and the Republican Party. And this came to a head, really, it was actually before the election. It was in just the weeks before the election, in particular in Pennsylvania, which was obviously a kind of the key battleground state heading into the election. Jones Day went to fight on behalf of the Republican Party in Pennsylvania, essentially trying to make it harder for mail-in and absentee ballots to count in a state where the expectation, and this turned out to be true, was that those ballots would be overwhelmingly in favor of Democrats. And the argument that Jones Day was putting forward was that we needed to maintain very strict deadlines on when ballots could be received and kind of the signature matching that went with ballots. And look, the arguments they were making, Jones Day makes the point that they were litigating legitimate, kind of hard to settle constitutional issues. Nobody disputes the bottom line here, which is that they were advocating a course of action that would make it harder for people to vote, and it most likely would have resulted in legitimate, honest votes being thrown out, and thus disenfranchising those people who, again, were overwhelmingly Democrats. And yeah, this sparked an uproar inside the firm. And basically a lot of people, again, on the left and the right within Jones Day, were just apoplectic about this and perceived, I think rightly, that this was something they were doing to help their Republican Party clients seize or maintain power, even if they didn't win outright in the vote. Now, it's really important for me to note here, because I don't want to get sued, that Jones Day was not one of the law firms that was involved in this like crazy, unhinged Sidney Powell type litigation after the election. Their litigation was confined to this a couple of actions in Pennsylvania that were, again, I'm saying the problems with that litigation, but they were much more legitimate than what the Sidney Powells of the world were doing. But in any case, again, this was people within the firm at senior levels on both the left and the right who viewed it as really dangerous, what the firm was throwing its weight behind.
When you take a look at Jones Day's client list over the last few decades, there's Trump, but there's also, it feels like reading off a list of like corporate serial killers. I mean, they represented big tobacco in some of its liability lawsuits, the Catholic Church as it tried to deal with the sexual abuse scandals, Fox News as it was fighting its own employees who were victims of sexual harassment, Purdue Pharma, the maker of Oxy, as it was creating and inflaming the opioid crisis, Abbott as it was dealing with the baby formula emergency. One question that came up in reading your book is, are Jones Day's clients the types of clients that other big law firms won't touch, or are they just really good at what they do and just really an iconic example, an emblem of the kinds of clients and work that is done by all of the similarly sized big law firms?
Well, the answer is both, which is unsatisfying, obviously. I mean, there are certain clients that Jones Day happily represents these days that that's at least some other big law firms just won't touch. I mean, the big tobacco is one example of that. Jones Day, as you mentioned, is for 40 years now been kind of the leading law firm behind RJR. Gun companies are another. Jones Day has represented Colt and currently represents Smith and Wesson. And those are both clients that many other kind of elite law firms just do not want to be involved with at this point. But a lot of the other stuff, and you mentioned Abbott Labs or Purdue Pharma, this is run-of-the-mill corporate litigation work and just other kind of lawyering work that is very much emblematic of the kind of amoral way that big law firms approach their jobs right now. And the reality is a client like Purdue Pharma that has just an endless array of legal difficulties is going to pay basically whatever it takes to get top law firms to do its bidding. And what really struck me as standing out about Jones Day, and this is probably true of other law firms too, but I've definitely seen it up close and personal with Jones Day, is that, there's nothing wrong with representing a client, even a terrible client, that's accused of wrongdoing. Everyone who is accused of wrongdoing deserves legal representation. But nobody has the right to legal representation that does some of the things that Jones Day has been accused of doing. And that ranges from intimidating witnesses to coaching witnesses in court and to hiding information from the government. And so this is, again, not to demonize Jones Day in particular here. The modern giant law firm has become just, they do whatever it takes to help these clients win. But sometimes, and I think one of the problems with the lack of scrutiny these firms have received is that if nobody's looking, then they get away with a lot of stuff that not only isn't appropriate, but also just has this really kind of insidious effect of tilting the scales of justice in almost universally in the direction of giant companies at the expense of people who have been, died from smoking cigarettes, or babies who have been poisoned after consuming powdered infant formula, or people who've overdosed on opioids and things like that. And so it's true that everyone deserves legal representation, but part of the problem with these law firms is that they suck up all the talent from law schools by paying out huge amounts of money. And that means that normal human beings and even small businesses or nonprofit organizations often really struggle to get high quality legal representation because law firms like Jones Day simply won't do that kind of work.
Okay, well, I want to play devil's advocate here because I know there are people listening who are thinking, look, Jones Day may be the Death Star of law firms, but our legal system is predicated on the idea that everyone gets to lawyer up. Everyone's lawyers are supposed to fight zealously for them. Let's set aside the potential super unethical, if not potentially not legal things that a law firm could do, like intimidating witnesses and the like. But within the realm of what's allowed, but kind of uncouth and kind of gross, that the idea is that everybody's lawyers are doing everything they can to defend them, and that the quote genius of the system is that the adjudicator that in both sides fighting like that will get closer to the truth. I mean, I guess in a sense, you hear this argument that, listen, you can't judge the lawyers for deciding to take the clients or the cases, for deciding to take Donald Trump as a client, or deciding to take some horrible corporation, because ultimately the system says that every defendant accused of doing something wrong is entitled to a really good legal defense. So maybe that's part of why the big law firms aren't scrutinized as an industry, because the perception is they are just mercenaries or a professional service inside of the system. When you look at what Jones Day, as an example, has done in your book, what's your response to that argument? Hey, they're just part of the system. They're just playing their role in the system.
I mean, I think it's hard to know even where to begin with that, because I think that argument is so pocked full of holes. But for starters, a lot of the work that I'm looking at in the book and that characterizes the modern law firm has nothing to do at all with clients who are constitutionally entitled to a legal defense. Right? These are the work they're performing for clients is lobbying governments to water down regulations or helping clients evade taxes, things like that. Or even in Purdue Pharma's case, they're not defending Purdue Pharma at Jones Day. They're helping it make an argument to extend the life of its patents on OxyContin and things like that. So first of all, those are not argument. You can make an argument about whether people are entitled to those legal services, but it is certainly not entitled under the Sixth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. Second, and more important, honestly, is that this adversarial system that you just described, it's a beautiful thing in principle. And when it works, it's a beautiful thing, but it often doesn't work the way it's supposed to. And a law firm like Jones Day, which has something like 2,500 lawyers all over the world, for all intents and purposes, in a case where they're going up against someone, a widow of a smoker who died of lung cancer, for example, they can throw every single resource they have at that case, which means they can go talk to the dead husband's high school buddies and see if he ever did drugs back in high school. They can go hire private investigators to go through the trash of the couple and see if he had a tendency to eat junk food. They can go, I can go on in that vein, and you magnify that over and over and over again, and it makes it basically impossible for someone who is representing the widow of the smoker to get, I think, a fair shake in court. So if both sides in a contested piece of litigation have something resembling a proportionate resources to wage legal battle, I think that's great. The system works really well. And you see that in all sorts of cases where one big company is fighting another for some reason. Where this really breaks down, and I think in just a devastating and kind of tragic way, is when you see people, individual people or small businesses that have been allegedly harmed by the actions of a big company, and they just get steamrolled in court. And their small town lawyers get steamrolled, everyone gets steamrolled. And I think you're increasingly seeing some federal judges and other kind of impartial and dispassionate legal experts really beginning to worry about this phenomenon.
Let's take it down to the micro here. And I'm not trying to get you to rip on any of your New York Times colleagues at all, but
here we go.
The newspaper that you work at recently published a much discussed column headlined, quote, "Is it okay to take a law firm job defending climate villains?" So I guess my question to you is, without litigating that specific column, what's your answer to that generally? There's this idea that, again, all defendants deserve some kind of representation, but some argue that kind of absolves the lawyers like Jones Day, absolves people from deciding to go work at Jones Day. So granted, there's a lot of different factors, debt and where do you get a job offer and all that kind of stuff. But that question of, is it okay? Is it ethically okay to take a law firm job defending something truly horrible?
Well, at the risk of kind of being a cop-out here, I think I can defer to what a bunch of lawyers at Jones Day and other big law firms have told me, which is that they believe it's not ethical. And so their solution to that, and one solution is just not to go work at a big corporate law firm. But as you just alluded to, people come out of law school with huge student debts, and the idea of being able to make a healthy six-figure income for a few years to pay down those debts is, it's pretty enticing. And so even, let's say you do go work at a corporate law firm, and there are plenty of examples of lawyers at firms like Jones Day that have essentially negotiated stipulations that they will not have to work on tobacco cases or gun cases or things like that. And, I think you can argue whether you could ever ethically represent a company whose product, when used as intended, kills you. I don't know. I think that, for me personally, that is not something I would do. And I think where I would personally draw the line is if, in the act of zealously representing my client, I would have to knowingly deceive the public or my opponents in court. That is, I think I would be personally very uncomfortable with that. And look, the counter argument is that is the very notion of aggressive lawyering. And especially when someone's accused of a heinous crime, they are entitled to, and they deserve, a really robust legal defense. And I don't think, I obviously have a huge ethical and moral problem with people murdering each other. But I also think that
Bold
murder
statement.
is even the most heinous. Yeah. Well, hey, you never know these days. So look, I think there is reasonable people can disagree on this, but it's not true, as some people in the legal industry like to say right now, that just carte blanche, there's no problem whatsoever representing even the worst corporate client in the worst situation because everyone's entitled to a lawyer. That is not true. And again, even people within the legal industry at firms like Jones Day don't believe that statement. And firms like Jones Day also, when it suits them, trumpet the fact that they are turning down this client or that client on, principled grounds. And the problem is it just doesn't suit them that often because it pays really good money.
All right, one last question here about solutions. You've mentioned it twice. I don't want to say that there's exactly a conspiracy theory, a full conspiracy going on, but law school debt, a subset of student debt generally. There's this idea out there that student debt, one of the reasons why corporate America writ large doesn't mind or actually likes student debt is that it keeps the labor force as a whole, the debt makes you have to make certain career choices. I say I don't want to say there's a conspiracy out there because I don't necessarily think there's like 20 CEOs sitting in a room being like, aha, we have to keep student debt high. I just think it's not solving that problem is not a priority in our politics because our politics reflects what largely what corporate America wants. And corporate America doesn't actually mind that people are have lots of student debt. As it relates to legal debt really does seem like a huge reason that lots of people get out of law school and make the choice to go to a place like Jones Day rather than doing environmental law or public interest law and the like. Do you think if we had if there was less legal debt, if there was need-based or public service, if you go into public service, you don't have as much student debt, much more robust programs to eliminate law school debt, that it would fundamentally change the legal system, or at least somewhat change the legal system to where not so many people had to go work for like a Jones Day or some other Death Star-like big law firm?
Yeah, and with the important caveat that I'm not an expert on the kind of the policy solutions here, I think that's right, basically. I mean, it's not just the feedback loop is even a little more intricate than you're describing, right? It's not just that the law firms prey on deeply indebted students and lure them with huge salaries that, with the promise that it'll help pay down their debt. And all of a sudden the students at law firms then kind of get used to this kind of comfortable lifestyle and don't want to change their jobs. It's more insidious than that because the law schools themselves are part of this ecosystem. And, they have a lot of these law schools essentially train and condition their students to go into big law because it makes them richer alumni. And those richer alumni are more likely to pay back the law schools in the form of contributions, essentially. And in terms of big names that will help recruit more students. And so it is a really kind of deeply enmeshed trap for students. And I think if the money equation was out of this, like if students could graduate from law school and have their choice without having to worry about whether or not they are going to drown in debt and constantly ballooning interest payments and things like that for the rest of their life, I think a whole lot of students would choose substantially different career paths. And I think that would probably go at least some way toward addressing this huge imbalance that we've been talking about, where normal people and institutions and businesses often cannot afford this kind of legal counsel that would enable them to stand up for their own rights against big, powerful companies. It is a really serious problem, and I think there's a chance that solution might work.
The book is called Servants of the Damned, Giant Law Firms, Donald Trump, and the Corruption of Justice. The author is David Enrich. You can find David Enrich at David Enrich on Twitter. He is runs business investigations for the New York Times. David, great work on this book. Super revelatory, a super undercovered topic, and so important. Thanks for writing the book, and thanks for taking the time with us.
Thanks for having me.